Good morning. Look, everybody's awake.
It's Sunday. Can you guys believe it's the last day? Oh, I know. Ooh.
Hey, I found a parking space this morning.
Yay.
Very exciting. Yay.
That's an important thing. Oh, so anybody who is here from yesterday, welcome back. And if this is your first time here, welcome. I'm Wyatt. I'm a multi-published paranormal romance and urban fantasy author. And to my right,
I am Corrina Lawson. I'm multi-published steampunk, paranormal romance, and right now I'm working on a gaming proposal. So which is kind of a really interesting way to look at story too. Thank you.
Yep, so today we're going to be talking about the hero's journey. One of the things that's really interesting about the hero's journey, even as a writer, is that it's always there. Even if you're not writing to it, you're kind of doing it, whether you realize it or not. It's pretty much in every scripted drama, movie that you watch, and pretty much every fictional story.
A lot of people understand hero's journey when not having a name for it, because if you read genre fiction, you know the hero's journey. If you watch Wonder Woman, you know the hero's journey.
Mm-hmm. If you've seen Star Wars.
If you've seen Star Wars, but it's kind of a structure that's almost instinctive in the way you tell stories. And Tolkien actually used to break down the influence of stories and storytelling, but all the way back down to Beowulf. You can see the hero's journey all that way back. And in fact, I'm glad to have that picture because this movie actually just says it right out loud. I'm going on an adventure, and you don't often get that sort of on the nose, recitation of the hero's journey. I'm going to do something new. In Wonder Woman, it's when she says, "Who will I be if I stay?" Which is a great line. A little less on the nose, but that's a great line.
That was a good line, definitely. Yeah, I thought we'd just get started off with this for that exact same reason, because it's just a very blatant, obvious, let's get ready to go kind of.
It's a dangerous business going out your front door.
Exactly. So when I was putting this together, I looked up, because I haven't done this in a while, what's a hero's journey, and I came up with all different representations of the hero's journey. As writers, I would say the one we probably see the most often is the one with the man in the walking stick. That's the typical representation. But then to find the board game and some of the more simpler looking ones I thought were kind of nice too.
Those are cool.
Yeah, they're very cool, especially this 3-act on a line almost. A 3-act. We should probably talk about the 3 acts too, because a lot of these work with a 3-act structure, which again is very common in plays, drama, although plays might have more acts, but even half-hour TV shows are kind of broken into a 3-act structure.
Who's watched any Law and Order episode ever? Okay?
Pretty much everybody.
Any Law and Order, it's just a perfect breakdown of 3-act structure. Because the original Law and Order is the crime, the detectives come, Act 1, 2, Act 2, the lawyers get involved, and you're on Act 2. And Act 3, things get worse, and there's a twist, and then there's the conclusion. I mean, it's just beautiful writing structure, which is probably why it's lasted so long, because it's a really instinctive thing for viewers to follow and watch.
Right.
And
you can time the commercials to it even if you really pay attention. After if it's 9:15 and they haven't revealed the bad guy yet, it's coming. Or if they reveal, like we used to do this at Bones, if they reveal the suspect at 8:30, it's not that person. Almost all the time. Like you knew the first person they met and interviewed with was going to be the bad guy, the person who did it.
But it's a beautiful 3-act structure.
Yeah, but you always forget by the time you get there. You forget about that first person. So yeah, I put the sources on the bottom if anybody you want to jot them down. That's where I got all these from. So some of them came with websites that actually explain them. The board game one is great because I don't know if you can see it. It's got like movies attached to it, like Aladdin. I think there's Indiana Jones in there, and it just it's not quite it's still circular, but it's not quite just a circle.
And how does this help you in writing? Who started a story and didn't know where to go with it? Okay, a lot of people. Mm-hmm. What you do is, you can pick up volumes that explain the hero's journey, Joseph Campbell and all the stuff, but what I do is I tend to look at stuff that I've loved and figure out how they wrote the middle and sort of deconstruct it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how you figure out what's in the middle, because the middle is where things get worse, and the end is where you resolve it. So if you've got an idea and you don't know where it's going, make things worse.
Right. What is that if you introduce a gun or a knife or an explosive conversation or blow something up? That's the other writer's wisdom.
Oh yeah, I like
blow
stuff.
something up. And it doesn't literally mean blow up a building. It could just mean blow up a relationship, have an argument, juicy dialogue.
Yeah, in mysteries, a lot of times the someone else gets killed.
Yep, kill somebody.
Or the detective gets attacked.
Romance novels, it's usually you have sex and that ruins everything.
Yeah. Well, that's
Sometimes.
hard to do. That's hard to do though. But there was an old movie, George Clooney and was it Jessica Lopez, Out of Sight?
Mm-hmm.
And he's a fugitive on the run, and she's a marshal, and they have sex, and things are so much worse because now they love each other, and she still has to bring him in.
Exactly. There's the
So.
conflict right there. Yep. Okay. So we're gonna break it down. I picked a modified version of this. The traditional hero's journey has a few more steps. This one's a little more condensed, and they have things like obtaining the elixir. I just felt this one was a little more relatable to the way we kind of think about things right now. And it kind of fits some of the movie examples we're going to talk about. So basically what this is I'm going to show you in another slide how this breaks into the 3-act structure. But you always have an intro and the call to action and crossing the threshold, and those are generally in the first act. And then the middle pieces are usually the mentor teaches the protagonist, the first challenge, temptation. Rock bottom can be like the dark moment, which is usually the end of Act 2 or the beginning of Act 3. And then you get to the final conflict and the return home. And I put sometimes there, and we're going to talk about why we have it like that. So, of course, we have Star Wars, the classic example of the hero's journey. I think Christopher Vogler has a book, I've got it in here somewhere, where he uses Star Wars and breaks it down into this kind of structure.
But you can see it in Wonder Woman, too.
Mm-hmm.
It breaks down pretty much almost perfectly. The only thing I'd warn you, in a movie, you're sitting there and you're going to watch that movie and you're going to give it probably at least halfway through, unless you walk out.
Mm-hmm.
In a book, you have a little less time, so because a reader can put your book down.
And they don't have to pick it back up.
If you go on Amazon Kindle and you want to read the first page, and if you're not caught by the first page,
mm-hmm.
That's the end of it. So you kind of have to introduce, not necessarily a call to action, but some sort of problem, conflict.
Exactly. You got to have a
in
hook
there.
in there somewhere.
But they did that pretty well in Wonder Woman. They showed beautiful Amazon. Well, they introduced, they had a little bit of flashback to the war with Ares, a prologue.
Right.
And then Diana's running around. But as she's running around, you're also seeing Amazon's preparing for war and Diana wanting to grab the sword, even little Diana. So, and that's pretty fast. I think we all want to stay with the Amazons a little longer.
Yeah, definitely.
But
Absolutely. And by the way, if you have questions or you want to talk about something, just please say so. I mean, this is interactive. Yes, in the back.
You just brought up the whole Wonder Woman thing. That's the issue with some of the comic book movies, that you're not getting enough time to develop the backstory of the heroes, and we're being almost rushed.
well, you can see in Suicide Squad there is none. And it's one of the reasons why, even though there's some moments in it, it just sort of, yeah.
Grinds to a halt.
Yeah, there's a little bit of character arc in there for Harley Quinn, but then she goes with the Joker, and then it doesn't work. So.
You right in the front.
I was just noticing the other day how much Moana follows
Yes.
the outline very well.
Disney.
But almost exactly.
Absolutely. Disney and Pixar, they've got this down to a science, an art. I would say an art, really. Absolutely.
So it seems like there's a need to have this real early hook. And like the most recent Jack Reacher thing, they kind of didn't screw up their story, but you see them having this fight in the bar, the restaurant, kind of the end of a previous novel. But in a lot of novels, you've got to have some thing, and I'm wondering about doing that. Like often it presages or gives you a hint of what's to come. How does that mess with this structure?
Well, for one thing, reach your movie or TV, what you have is a series, and what you have is kind of somewhat of a hero who takes the hero's journey over like multiple books. So you might see a hint of I'm starting a different life. I'm trying to think of.
He's got more of a flat arc.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and what you'll
Yeah.
see is the hero's journey actually undertaken by some of the secondary characters. And you get that with a lot of series books. As far as movies, I haven't seen the Reacher movies because
Tom Cruise.
Tom Cruise.
Yeah.
Sorry. But you can actually, in his earlier movies, the sequel to The Hustler, you can see that breaks down along the hero's journey as well. But series stuff is interesting because you want to spread it out. Captain America's arc is very interesting because it doesn't quite get there with the hero's journey until the Avengers.
Right.
Really?
That's right, yeah.
You don't quite get the ending to it.
Well, the real question was about the people, I've seen it maybe more in novels where you need this hook in the book.
Mhm.
Yeah, you do.
That, because you want to open the first 2 pages and be into it.
Right.
But it might be a temptation, it might be some hint of the conflicts to come. To me, it feels kind of mixed about whether that's a good thing or not.
Well, as a writer, I tend to write and then add the structure after. A lot of writers will impose the structure first and know where they're going. And then they revise to get that. Usually the best hook, sometimes the best hooks come right away, but sometimes they don't come until after you've finished the book
Right.
and you know where you're going. There's a Jennifer Cruzy book, she writes romance, that starts with a wife finding another woman's panties in her husband's car's glove compartment. And that's a pretty good hook. But I think it took her 5 revisions to get to this is where my story starts. And this is the hook I'm going to use to start it.
Right, and I would also add to that, beginning writers, typically like you go to writers groups and stuff, and they'll usually, a lot of times what you'll hear is the story really starts over here, because we tend to overload the front, and the more you write and the more accomplished you become at it, you start to realize you may write it anyway, but you understand that at some point you're going to dump it. Because the beginning of your story is the foundation for your entire book, and it does lead into the end. So, readers expect a beginning, middle, and end, and some kind of satisfying conclusion. And I can't tell you the number of times you go on Amazon, if somebody says it ends on a cliffhanger, I'm like done. I'm like, I don't want to read something that just cuts off in the middle. I want to know what happens. So, yeah, you could definitely write it that way. It's just understand that your book is like a fluid thing, and you're probably going to be cutting it. I know the first chapter, even now for me, is like still a struggle. Like I can almost always know when it's not quite right, but you just keep going.
See, I'm the weird person who starts too late. In one of I wrote a superhero paranormal series, kind of X-Men-like, and the first scene that I wrote is now on page 100. So I had to go back.
And
I had to go back. So different writers use different process. What you're seeing is finished work.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't want you guys to think if you wrote something and it's not,
it's got to be perfect. Right out of the
it
gate.
doesn't follow this. It just means that's the work that goes on in revisions. Most writers usually take one draft, although Heinlein used to finish his first drafts and sell them. So I hate him.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, you also find the hero's journey in the tarot, specifically the major arcana cards, beginning with the Fool, which is like the call to action,
Mm-hmm.
crossing the threshold, the High Priestess, rock bottom, the Tower, and the last card being the World with completion, which is also an aspect of the return home. And for writers, the tarot is very good, especially with the major arcana cards, for archetypes. And for writers, that would be maybe something very helpful.
Yes,
Yes.
actually that's true. We had somebody come into our writers group, was it last year, and actually did the hero's journey through the tarot cards. It was fascinating. It was very, very interesting. So yeah, that's a good tool too. Okay, so let's break this down into acts. The 3-act structure, again, if you're writing fiction, you really should be, not necessarily, you shouldn't hamstring yourself with this, but it kind of helps you plot it out, like the saggy middle thing is like a real thing that happens, And it kind of, like, most people know the beginning, and sometimes you know the end too, or you just know the end and you work your way backwards. I think it's James Scott Bell says you should write from the middle.
Well, that's what I do.
that.
I tend to start with Act 2.
Yeah,
Act 1 apparently is boring to my writer brain. So.
yeah.
Easier to read.
Yeah, some,
Act 2 is easier to write.
Yeah, but I'm giving a workshop on saggy middles at Fiction Fest in September for CPRWA, and you can Google Fiction Fest
I actually
Connecticut.
have a
Okay.
brochure thingy down here. If anybody's interested, they have little tabs on it. If you're local or nearby and you're interested, come on up after and get one.
But the fact that I don't write saggy middles is because I start with the middle,
Yeah.
and I have trouble coming up with the beginning.
Yeah.
Um,
So, Act 1.
But we're very much of a what's going to happen now book world, especially now that you can look in the pages of any first book ever on Amazon or bnn.com.
Yes, David.
Oh, question. Okay. I mean, I was just going to say that when you think about it, all stories have to start in the middle because there was a world going on before you started telling your story. Like the world existed probably for thousands of years before you jumped into it, and it's like so you have to kind of find, okay, well, where is the right point to start this particular
Yeah, that's
story? Because it will, the world existed first, and it will go on once the story is over.
Exactly. That's a really good way of thinking of it.
Yeah, you can see that with George R. R. Martin.
I've been paying a lot of attention lately to how people build in backstory, like backcasting, and it almost seems like a couple of things I've read lately, you're in the call to action and the introduction to the hero's world is done through backcasting throughout, at least the first act and sometimes into act 2.
Flashbacks. Flashbacks are really hard to write well. I wrote one novel with flashbacks. I don't know how well it turned out. It was a reunion story of a couple, so it had their contemporary problems, and it would flash back to how they met until eventually the stories dovetailed. You could see it well done in places like Lost or Person of Interest. Their flashbacks were awesome. The first season of Arrow, they did an interesting thing. The flashbacks showed Oliver Queen it was his hero's journey to becoming a very traumatized person.
Mm-hmm.
And then on the flip side, in the present day, it was his move from, his call to action was coming back and becoming the person to save the city. So he actually had 2 heroes' journeys there, and they were at the opposite, which made the first season of Arrow so good. And if you want a story how to do it wrong, you can watch the flashbacks in later seasons and see how they don't match up and there's no journey and it doesn't work. So that's really hard to pull off. A lot of people are trying it, and it's kind of handicapping yourself.
I would say Once Upon a Time did that really well.
That's what I was gonna
In the
say.
very first season and a half.
They rely heavily on flashbacks, and mostly it works out pretty well. I think if you watch them together, it makes
Yeah.
like usually they don't make sense, but I think most of them. Sometimes they
Exactly.
explain things way later in flashbacks. I explain after that.
I mean, I think Lost kicked it off. They had the brilliant episode with Locke, which is probably one of the best episodes of TV ever, even though I later grew disenchanted with Lost. But you see Locke, how he got to the plane crash, and you see why he's the person now with the big reveal at the end. Everybody's seen Lost, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a really good way, but you can't do that, I think, unless you understand the structure of the regular story, and then you can play with it. So you can break the rules or shift them or move them around, but you have to know why you're doing it, and you have to do it consciously. It's sort of like jazz.
Mm-hmm.
If you're going to do free jazz, you actually have to understand jazz very thoroughly
Yeah.
to start just going off and doing what you're doing.
I would say one of the most fascinating movies, I don't know how many people have seen Cloud Atlas. That movie has like six heroes' journeys, 6 3-act structure things going on inside of it, and it's like 3 hours long, but it's worth it. I mean, at first you feel like I have no idea what's going on. But as you watch it, you start to recognize as each person's having their dark moment almost simultaneously, it moves the story along using that structure and all these mini little 3 acts going on and heroes' journeys for each of these characters. It's amazing. So, if you want to look at something that'll like blow your mind,
Well,
I recommend that.
And character really is story. I know some
Yes.
people come up with plot first, and that's cool. But you have to have the reason everybody's here possibly because they fell in love with a particular character or a particular moment. You don't go, oh, Westeros, that's so awesome. I want to hang out in Westeros. No, you want to read George R. R. Martin because you're interested in what happens to Jaime and Daenerys and Jon Snow and some of the other characters. You're attached to that story because you're attached to the characters.
Right. So, back to this though, the
Yes.
introductions to the hero's world. I kind of think this kind of goes back to the question about backstory. Usually I would say, again, it's the first time you want to tell everybody everything immediately about this person. And really you should resist the urge to do that. You want to know just enough about this person to be interested in them, and you learn it along the way. So you don't want to tell their entire life story in the first 50 pages, because you kind of have taken away your ability to make that person interesting as they go along. So the introduction to the hero's world is like that basement. Where are they at in the world right now? Kind of back to the whole, the world has already existed. What's going on with this person? Hopefully they're in some form of distress, or they're not quite happy with their world. And that's kind of where you start off. Like Luke Skywalker, I'm unhappy. I don't want to be on a farm anymore.
Yeah, and they cut. Yes.
Yeah.
I took an animation class a few years ago where we had to write a 90-minute film. And one of the things that he told us to do was to give them a save the cat moment in the very first 15 minutes ideally of the movie, to endear the character to you and to make you invested in their story, which I've used since then and has been a really successful technique for me to make people kind of invested in the story and show a little bit of who that character is and the way that they interact with the world in that first introduction to the world that they're currently in.
Yeah.
And it's like the opening to characterization, I think.
Yes.
How
Yeah,
I thought
it's in the opening. I think I started one of my books because it was a cloning story. There was a woman who was pregnant, found out she was pregnant, didn't know why, and it was going to have an abortion. And I thought, well, I've got a problematic heroine because people are instantly going to have their opinions. So I had her save a little boy from a car accident. And that developed after, and it was related to the overall plot. But those are really valuable. I think, again, my writing teacher used to say there are a few ways to grab the reader's attention for characters. One of them is save the cat. The other is that they're really competent at what they do. And you can see that with a lot of villains. They're interesting because they're really good at what they're doing. Meryl Streep in where she plays the fashion editor.
Prada.
Yeah, Devil Wears Prada. You're instantly interested. You may not think she's likable, but she's competent, and she knows what she's doing, she's very confident, which is another way to grab a character. But the only thing I'd urge with Save the Cat is you gotta kind of not make it feel artificial. We writers can see it.
Yeah. But not most readers, though. Call to action and crossing the threshold. Those things can happen apart or together, depending on the way your story is structured. Call to action is, and usually there's also a step in here that I don't have in here, is the refusal of the call. Sometimes they'll say, you must come and do whatever, and the person's like, no, I'm not going to do that. There's a fair amount of stories where you kind of see, I'm happy, I'm not going to leave my world. Kind of like The Hobbit, actually. That's probably a good example of that. He initially didn't want to do it, and then he did.
Yeah, and in Wonder Woman, the call to action is very dramatic. Steve drops right in front of her. But she doesn't choose to go until she gets on the boat with him. And then in Captain America, you see he never refuses.
Right.
He
But
never
that's who he
refuses
is. That's who he
because
is.
that's who he is. It gives him a slightly flatter arc, but then again, it's a lot of the people around him
Right.
who have arcs,
Yeah.
and so Tolkien really understood 3-act structure. Lord of the Rings, you can see this too with
Yeah.
Frodo. The call to action for.
Take 18 years later.
Well,
Yeah.
18 years later, maybe I should take the ring to Rivendell.
Yeah.
So that's, and it takes a while for Frodo to get his act together
Yeah.
after his call to action. And You can still do that, but depending on how you want to pace your story, it can just happen simultaneously. I'm trying to think of a super good example. Indiana Jones gets the book about finding a lost ark. Indiana Jones never refuses a call to action. He's always going to go find the thing.
Right. So when you get the call to action, crossing the threshold is literally where they make the choice to leave their life to do whatever it is you're setting them up to do.
A lot of times it's called the point of no return,
Yep.
where
That
you
one too.
you can't go back to where you were.
Right. Like sometimes, like their house gets blown up and their life is destroyed and they've got nowhere
Yeah,
else to go.
the
Like
Wizard
a
of
weird-
Oz,
Yeah.
Dorothy's house
House is
literally
gone.
gets flipped up and dumped on her. Yeah, that's kind of a. Oh, question.
Sometimes the author will make a call to action and subtle or not give their choice, like you said with Dorothy. Hey, okay. Hey, I don't want to go to Oz. I want to stay here on my next little farm in Kansas. Sorry, tornado says otherwise.
Exactly.
For people are front, they go build pigs, you need to go kill the Dark Lord, or the
Yeah, that's good. Natural disasters or wars.
I suddenly have power or the warp reality unless get help from the Grand High Poobah somewhere over the rainbow.
Yeah, Doctor Strange is really good at refusing to be heroic, and Rogue One actually, Jin. You see her, I'm done. I'm not doing it. They made some really interesting editing choices in that film from what it used to be, and if you're a Star Wars geek and you want to learn structure instead of going to books like this that'll break down the structure, you could read up on what edits they made and why they made them. Like in the first Star Wars movie, they cut out Big Starklighter.
Isn't Star Wars specifically based on Hero's Journey because he was friends with the writer?
He had read Joseph Campbell, so he knew about that structure, but I don't want to say Lucas, pretty much you can go back 20, 30 years in movies. His Girl Friday is a great 3-act structure movie. Rosalind Russell walks in and says, I'm going to get married. And they're like, yeah, but there's an escaped prisoner. And so she wants to cover it because she's really a reporter. And then it's a comedy, but you can see the 3-act structure in there. So, storytelling is kind of the same all in one. Joseph Campbell sort of broke it down differently than anyone had before in a really readable way. But you can see it in Jane Austen or Sherlock Holmes.
He kind of pointed it out.
Yeah.
He kind of.
Well, he also broke it down into. We're still using his terminology because it was a really good, insightful way to break it down.
Right. So, once they've crossed the threshold, they're into the meat of the story. So usually, like in screenwriting and books, they have it like the thirds, so the first third or the first quarter is Act 1. You get to know the character, and then you screw up their life and move them along into Act 2, where everything happens. That's where, they, and we talk about agency, this is what we're talking about. Character agency, if you were in the kick butt panel yesterday, we were kind of talking about they don't let things happen to them, but I will caveat that with, they kind of do here. There's usually a point in a story where things are happening to them and they're trying to get their bearing, and by the time you meet the midpoint, they should be making a decision to take charge and no longer let things happen to them all the time.
Well, one thing that's not here, it's probably would be a whole nother workshop, is the antagonist thinks the story is about them. So they are doing things that the protagonist reacts to, and a story is basically antagonist acts, protagonist reacts,
Right.
and so on. And Ares in Wonder Woman, or Darth Vader in Star Wars.
Right.
So that's not quite here, but as things happen, you can see it should be the protagonist who makes things worse.
Right.
in your story?
Their choices can make things even worse. They make bad decisions based on whatever. Fear, misinformation, like Pride and Prejudice is an example of that, misinformation. She makes a snap judgment about Mr. Darcy and turns out she's completely wrong. Mentor teaches protagonist. I always think of Gandalf for some reason, or Yoda. I don't know, is that represented in the structures? Usually that person falls at some point,
They tend to.
They tend to go away.
in Wonder Woman, it's entropy.
Right.
who teaches, and you see that it happens. But then Steve sort of takes it up at a certain point. So you can have the Mentor character sort of is kind of very fluid, and like Gandalf is really kind of a lousy Mentor because he just says you must do this, and I'm not going to show you how to do that, but don't do that. And Yoda is busy spouting, do it or not. There is no try. That's not really helpful when you're trying to learn something.
I was thinking about Jessica Jones, and
Mm-hmm.
her antagonist is essentially her mentor in some ways. I thought. He's always kind of pushing her, saying you can do these things with your powers, even as he's trying to manipulate her.
Yeah, I mean, that's what makes him such an effective villain, because he understands her probably better than anybody.
But it seems like there are other stories where the antagonist becomes the mentor to almost a provocative, testing.
Mm-hmm.
The Flash as well.
Yeah, the Flash.
Yeah, that is a good example. Yep.
And that's a good way. And then at a certain point, you turn. That's part of the I'm not going to do what you said I should do. And you can see. I'm trying to think of a good example. Back to Tolkien. At one point, his mentors. I mean, Gandalf sort of is, but the dwarves are kind of his mentors. And at one point, Thorin says, "Don't do this. We're going to fight a war." And Bilbo changes his mind, and that comes much later. But it's an effective scene because Thorin and the dwarves are his friends and his mentors. So mentor is something that you can really play with and have a lot of fun with if you know what you're doing.
Right. So first challenge, when I see first challenge, I think, well, there shouldn't just be one challenge, but this is like the initial moment in time when you almost see this a lot, and you do see it in books and movies where they think they've got it figured out. You've got the answer. I'm going to do this plan, and you know it's not going to work. They don't know that, but you know it. And you should have a moment like that in your story where they're constantly being stopped or hindered either by themselves or by an outside force. And sometimes it's both, actually. I mean, your character, to be a full person, should have their own internal reasons for doing things and not just always being reacting, because then they're just like generic person in movie X running around. I guess like a lot of summer movies.
Well, in Wonder Woman, it's when she enters no man's land.
Right.
I mean, she has other challenges as she goes through, but that moment is sort of, this is who I am. And then things get much worse after that, which is really horrifying.
Right.
What happens to the village. And then,
That was a great moment.
which is a great moment. So it was a heroic moment, but at the same time, you could tell that she wasn't going to stop the war with it. And then she later finds she didn't even save the village.
Villagers, yeah.
The villagers that she so wanted to
That was
save.
sad. So for Wonder Woman, for temptation, I'm trying to think, would she have a temptation moment?
Yeah, she did, but it was mixed into Act 3. It's the moment when Ares says, "Join me."
Yeah.
Mhm.
And that's the moment where she really is at rock bottom at that point. Steve is dead. Humanity's not what she thought it was. And it's actually, I think it sort of gets overshadowed by No Man's Land. But when she goes up to take on Ares, she's not doing it because she's angry. Like when Steve died, she reacted very vengefully and set loose the god powers and knocked them all over. But she's sort of very quiet and saying, this has to be done. Goodbye, brother. So she's back to who she is. So it can be a real flash moment. But you can see, once you're aware of the structure, you can start picking them out and stuff. And it will drive people who don't pick out the structure crazy.
We'll get to that.
Yeah.
Question.
I was wondering if the first challenge is when the protagonist accepts their role. If not until that point, maybe have they actually accepted that they have this power or the responsibility or whatever, but until they meet a successful challenge.
Yeah, I am. I'm trying to think. It's when Luke rescues Leia. I think that's possibly the first biggest challenge.
Well, I was thinking
For
more
him.
where people are forced across this threshold. They didn't make the choice to do this, but then they finally they when they meet a challenge and overcome it, then they finally accept their role.
Right, and that gets back to the old agency thing. You know, there's like a point in time when the character needs to kind of own what's going on, whether they like it or not. And that depends on the type of story. I mean, there are some stories where people are just caught up in a wave and they have choices to make, otherwise they're not going to survive. And then there's more quieter, like drama stories where it's not so obvious that that's going on, but it is.
I was thinking of Harry Potter a little bit. I mean, he accepts being a wizard and whatnot, but one of the reasons that last book is so powerful is Harry did not ask to be a Horcrux. He did not ask to be bonded to Voldemort. His whole life has been screwed up by what happened to him when he was a baby. And the moment where he accepts that he basically has to choose death, and that's the moment where he accepts all that's happened to him. And you can see this with a lot of, I'm a good person stuck in a bad situation, and you don't know which way they're going to go. I mean, we're talking about heroes here, triumphant, but a villain's journey is when they hit that moment and they go, the first X-Men First Class.
Oh yeah, that's a good example.
With Magneto and Xavier on the beach. And you can see Xavier has chosen, neither one of them chose to have the missiles fired at them, and they're fighting. And, Magneto says, never again. And, he stops because Xavier gets the bullet. But you can see right there, somebody chooses to be a hero and somebody chooses to be a villain and accepts who they are. But I don't think Magneto had really, you can see him throughout that movie choosing, I don't want to be, this isn't the right thing. I just want to go kill Nazis, which I think is pretty good goal in its own. But he keeps refusing who he is. And then at the end, he brings it in, and of course he ends up being a villain, but the reluctant choice, like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, I mean, didn't she spend the whole first season going, I don't want to be a Slayer. This kind of, sorry Giles, this sucks. This is not what I want to do. I'm going to die. Why am I chosen? I don't want to do it. And then, of course,
Can I just go to high school?
Yeah, can I just go to high school?
There's a question over there. You still have your question? No. Okay. All right, we got to move
He has
this
a question.
Okay.
I was wondering if you could talk about the hero's journey in a series form where there's a larger arc over the course of the whole series, but each individual episode or book needs its own arc, and how you factor the mini hero's journey.
Well, really quickly, because I know we have, we might run short on time. Really quickly is what you do is you break this down over the course of 1 to whatever books, and you have a different moment in each book. But that's the base of what you start with.
I think if you're doing more than one character too, you could introduce like somebody else's hero's journey starts in book 2.
Right.
And the end of book 1.
Yeah, you do see that a lot, especially romance novels, actually. That's how you know who the next book is going to be about. Okay, so we have the final act, which is the final conflict, and the Wonder Woman example was actually a really good one because she had the temptation and rock bottom kind of happen simultaneously, which does happen, and then the final conflict, final battle, could be your big action moment, your big scene, or like in a romance, it's when they realize they want to be together and it gets worked out there. And then the return home sometimes, which is where we're going to talk about this, is, they go either in their new state, like say you're like King Arthur, like I'm now the king, or you're now Dorothy, I'm now home, literally home, or sometimes you don't make it home.
No, or you're Frodo and you have to go across the sea to the west.
Right.
Unless you think Sam is the hero of the story, in which case he does go home.
Right. Okay. So, just real quickly, we kind of touched on this already right at the very beginning about why it matters, and it's really because it's there all the time, and as a writer, it's like your friend. And I'll say this again later, even though it's your friend, you don't have to write necessarily thinking about this, because I think a lot of people just do it instinctively because we all read, we all watch movies, we all watch TV, so you've kind of already absorbed like a muscle movement, what it is that you're doing.
Yeah, my writing teacher used to say the first draft is your don't look down draft, which means you don't look at anything but the story that's going through you.
Yep.
And then later you can impose structure.
Exactly. Okay, so we also have sort of talked about this too. These are just some classic examples. So if you're looking for things to watch or kind of get a feeling. Some of these are series, some of these are actually, just one-off stories, like The Wizard of Oz. But Westworld is another example. I guess I put Samwise on Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, I was thinking about the refusal of the call to action, and I saw Toy Story. Pixar is so great. Like, we've all seen Up, right? The refusal.
Yes.
I mean, the old man in that story, he keeps no, 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 until the moment where he's literally carrying the weight of his entire existence, the house, on his back, which is just like brilliant writing. And then finally, when he lets the house go, he becomes the hero. So that's a very good example of no, 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 no.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, fine, I'll do it.
Yeah. Actually, and I don't know how many people, I know it was like one of those, it makes you cry in the first 5-minute movies too, by showing you this band, and they made that work. I mean, I don't know that you could make that work in a book, but that moment in the movie, it was like, wow, you already felt for this guy like immediately. Okay, so let's talk about two different movies. One works and one really doesn't. I picked this because I figured everybody's seen it. It's a more current example. And I know when we saw Age of Ultron, we were just like, something's not right with this movie. It just didn't work. And I think for me personally, it was because there was no growth in any of the characters. Like Tony Stark especially, just, yeah, he did regress. And it wasn't very satisfying. I was like, what you're looking at here is it's got the steps of the journey in here, but somewhere along the way, the Age of Ultron just kind of went off the tracks.
Yeah, it just, like Bruce Banner, who had a very quiet arc in the first Avengers movie of which ends with I'm always angry.
Yeah.
And in the second book, he's like, yeah, let's just do artificial intelligence. What could go wrong? Even though I'm the scientist who made an experiment go wrong and created a weapon of mass destruction, i.e. me, but let's do that. And there's not even and they get called on that later, but the motivation for doing that is not as clear. I mean, heroes are allowed to make bad choices, but you kind of have to understand why. And why? Because they needed Ultron to exist, which is not a good story answer.
Yeah, no, and I can say right away, if you try to force people to do things in your books, readers are going to call you on it. They're going to know that you have turned somebody or something.
The character's going to fight you the whole way.
Yeah, you've turned them into a tool and you're twisting it to make the story work, and people can tell, even if they don't know quite why it's happening, they know something's wrong.
Well, you can see in the first Avengers movie, Captain America moves from trying to make you part of the world, and he takes the leadership, he goes public. Iron Man learns that he needs to be part of a team.
Right.
He tells Cap at the end, call it Cap. And Widow has the whole arc about Red in her ledger and how she can choose to be a hero. It's very subtle, and you can't always hit them very specifically and as hard as you can when you have a single character. But in the second movie, it's just like, it doesn't really go anywhere with the characters. Ultron actually has the most interesting arc in the movie, which is good. You want a villain to have an arc, but when you don't have a protagonist that really opposes him. Tony was supposed to be, but, it's like, let's just do AI. And I know his mind got messed with. About the best character arcs in that movie are actually Witch and Quicksilver, because you can see them moving. Most of the people I talked to who liked the movie thought Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver liked them. And the reason why is, if you want to go back to story structure, is because they have a journey.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, they're supporting characters and they can't carry the whole story.
No.
Even though you can actually see, a lot of people love Force Awakens, so I'll give you my little why Force Awakens didn't work for me. Well, one, it almost tried to recreate the first Star Wars movie, and I kind of wanted to see a new movie. But what it is you have 3 main characters, and none of them have a complete story arc that you can really hold. Finn is actually the one with the most interesting situation. You can see it set up. This is who I'm supposed to be, and then he is forced into the situation where he has to kill people and he gets the blood on his helmet, and then his call to action is, I can't do this, I can't be this, and he goes to the pilot. And then the movie kind of leaves Finn and goes to Rey, and Rey is very much of a flat character. She never, her character arc is very flat. It's compared to Luke, who lost. It's like, oh yeah, Rey knows how to pilot a ship, Rey knows how to do this, and it's not that she's a Mary Sue. It's just that the movie is very clouded about what kind of arc they want, and so the moment where she grabs the lightsaber should feel like the culmination of her refusal, except she hasn't been through all the steps that Luke did, and so the movie takes the most interesting character with the biggest arc, which is Finn, and sidelines him at the end for a character who had kind of a flat arc, and that's why it wasn't quite as resonant to me. But you can see, if you try to break it down, you can get good, and it was very entertaining, and there's a lot of other stuff going on in the movie, but it didn't quite get there the way Rogue One did for me, which I thought Rogue One was brilliant. And you can see every single character arc in that movie, and there's 7 of them, and they're all co-leads, and it was really brilliant the way, Jin refuses to call to action. The moment where they chose to, it's a great call to action, and then change to the third act, they say Rogue One. I mean, the reason that resonates is it's perfect story structure. And then you can see in The Force Awakens, there's not really a moment you can point to like that, that goes, I guess it's when they go to rescue Rey, but it doesn't quite have the resonance as Rogue One, call sign.
Absolutely. So, kind of to jump onto that is that if you go to Captain America Civil War, all of a sudden you're like, oh, it's back. And you can really feel the difference. And again, that movie has multiple characters, but yet it still works together because they all have a very definitive purpose. Like, you know exactly where Black Panther's coming from. You know what the Winter Soldier's running away from. Even the guy who's there, I can't even think of his name, the psychiatrist dude. Yeah, I mean, he's got an agenda too, and it still works. But for whatever reason, we kind of, in our family, we were kind of like, we just kind of felt like Avengers was the movie that was like pulling pieces together for the rest of the universe, and it wasn't that was its whole purpose. Kind of like if you watch Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. there for a while, it just seemed to be springboarding other things, and it's like, well, what about these people? Do they get a story or not?
It's gotten better.
Yeah, it's gotten better.
It's gotten way better.
It lost me after that. So while we're still on the subject, is that some stories work and some really just don't. I actually watched The Huntsman Winter War. I don't know why. I thought maybe it'd be better than the first one. And it just still, again, had that same flat, you got 2 beautiful, wonderful actresses on the screen as these really badass witches. And it's just still, you didn't feel anything for them. It was just kind of like, okay.
I think the biggest example I can think of is not Raiders of the Lost Ark. He starts with trying to steal. He steals something, and he ends with saying, "Don't look, don't look, don't look." And there was a movie made with Tom Selleck about the same time where they tried to recreate Indiana Jones, and he has no character arc, and the movie just died. And nobody remembers the movie probably.
Yeah, I sort of vaguely remember that.
And it had Tom Selleck, so could have been good, but
yeah.
On your list here, you're saying Brave is the fail?
No, it's an example of something that would work. So Frozen, like if you watch Frozen, and again, we're going back to Disney, you've got the Ice Queen thing going on, but you've got the sisterly relationship that works. Well, The Huntsman, you've got 2 sisters, and it just doesn't hang together at all.
Well, no, you're talking about except Brave and Monsters University.
Oh, yes. For those 2, yeah, Brave and Monsters University, for Pixar, were total misses. They're just...
Well, it may have been that the story structure was actually too obvious and too predictable.
Yeah, possibly.
In both of those, although I thought Monsters University did a good job with Sully confessing that he'd raped things, which added a twist. But Brave is almost, I won't do this, and you can see her change, and I find the relationship between her and her mother interesting. But it's almost too, like, you can see exactly where it's going, so it suffers. It has the hero's journey in there, but it's so on the nose.
Too predictable.
Too much.
Yeah,
exactly.
it's just like really on the nose. I mean, which is a different problem. I mean, you could do the hero's journey and have something like Brave, but Brave didn't reach a lot of people. So,
Yeah.
how are we doing?
We got 10 minutes.
Okay.
So we've been talking about this already too. Why does it happen? I mean, for the Marvel movies, I'm just going to jump to dot point number 3. And even like the Tim Burton Batmans, all of a sudden you suffer from way too many villains. It's like, can we just have one, please? They're like 3, 4. And I feel like that also detracts away from the story because your hero is only as good as your villain. And if you have too many villains, who is the hero reacting to?
Yeah, I mean, Suicide Squad, I guess Enchantress, but I don't know. Waller's kind of a villain too. I mean, she just kills people randomly and puts brain bombs in people, and they react to Waller at the end rather than Enchantress, who's sort of very basic. You know, has anyone seen Chinatown? Right. All right.
Yes.
If you write literary fiction, you can play with structure, but Chinatown is basically all through Jack Nicholson's point of view, trying to find out what happens. And at the very end, he's not allowed to be part of the conclusion of the story. And a lot of people love this. I watched the movie and it made me mad. I was just so mad because they lead it up to him doing something. And then I guess the conclusion is that he can't change things, but it's such a passive conclusion.
Feels
that
kind of
it-
like the 70s itself, you know?
Yeah, it's just like,
reflection of the time
it's just
we're in.
Chinatown.
Yeah.
We've been following you here, and none of that matters. Literary fiction kind of does that a lot, and some people love it.
I don't.
I want a story, which is not to say literary fiction is wrong, but most of us here are probably genre fiction readers and writers, and if you don't get that story structure right, you're gonna find readers are not gonna follow you.
Exactly.
Actually, Tolkien's evils were foreshadowed.
Yeah.
They do show up several times.
But not, well, yes.
In Lord of the Rings, they
Yeah,
say Gandalf.
They do.
You know?
They do. But then the question always is, why didn't they just fly them into Mordor?
Because the Nazgul were there.
Yeah, I know.
They had to take down the Nazgul at the battle. Yes.
So we do that with the original plan,
Mm-hmm.
and then they ended up having to go to Moria and everything.
Everything fell apart. Yeah. So the other thing I'd mention is complicated plots, because we haven't really talked about that, require lots of exposition to make sense. And I kind of pin this Thor: The Dark World as one of those with the whole ether and the everybody's always explaining everything every 5 minutes. There's some TV shows that are like that where the character is only there to explain things to people.
As you know, Bob.
As you know, Bob.
Anybody read Jim Butcher?
Yeah.
Yeah, Bob the Skull. He
Yeah.
actually named Bob the Skull because his writing teacher said, avoid as you know, Bob stuff in writing. And so he was like, well, fine, I'll make him a skull. So he did. And that can serve a purpose. But if it happens throughout your story, if your character is sitting there saying something out loud, saying, I can't figure out why or that's a clue that you as the writer can't figure it out. So
Right. Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. So, some guidelines if you're a creator of any kind of content, story-wise, not just writers. Like you were talking about comics and other forms of art. It's a guideline. It's not a formula. I actually did look up things that are successful that people really like that don't follow this hero's journey. And one of them was My Neighbor Totoro, which I know lots of people love. I love it. And it just never really occurred to me. I'm like, there really isn't kind of a structure here. It's just really cute. Pulp Fiction was another example.
I guess if you put it together, it kind of has a structure,
Yeah.
but it had little mini character arcs sometimes in the little mini scenes. But,
There's also the whole thing about whether you present your hero's journey in a chronological fashion.
Yeah.
Right, in a
exactly.
you can play with chronology. Memento,
Memento, I was just going to say
which
that.
played it backwards,
Backwards, yeah.
which can be tricky in flashbacks. You can really do anything you want with a story. You don't have to follow his journey and hit all those.
No, you
But
don't.
you kind of have to be aware that it exists, because every trade-off you make in a story that's different from the usual structure is a trade-off of, will I lose my readers here? So it's not something you should think about when you're writing, but when you're revising, it's something to think about. Or if a reader says, I just lost interest here, it tends to mean something's missing from your character arc.
Right.
So,
Yep.
we have more? Are we done?
One more. Okay,
Mhm.
so Corrina touched on this earlier, the armchair critic. So now that you have all this knowledge, one of the things, and this happens to writers, is that you get more critical the more you know. And it kind of takes away the joy of reading or watching things, because then you feel the internet too. It kind of takes away the joy of just enjoying movies. You don't have to sit there and pick movies, films, books, things apart while you're watching
It
them.
does help if you don't like something.
Yes,
You
it's
can
great for
pick it apart.
explaining why you don't like it, for sure.
But sometimes you can like things and it doesn't have. You just think it's cool. Like
Right.
Sharknado really
Yeah.
has no character arc. I'm sorry, Sharknado has no character arcs really. I guess nominally the daughters, but there are sharks eating helicopters. I mean, so your point is invalid. It's just fun to watch. You had the question about serial. If you want to know about serial character arcs, I would watch Person of Interest. And flashbacks, because there's a scene in season 5 which starts with narration with Amy Acker's voice, and it's basically like, this is how we fought back, and so it's a flash. The whole season is sort of a flashback, but that narration, your understanding of that narration actually changes 3 times during the final season, which is only 13, and by the time you actually realize what the narration really means, what you've done, the character arc for the machine is complete, and it's really brilliant. And I want to take the Person of Interest people and put them in charge of EC movies because they know what they're doing. But it's brilliant because the machine is the AI, and it's only called the machine. It has a character arc over 5 seasons. So if you want, and all the characters have character arcs. In the very last episode, everybody's character arc is completed. At least for the characters to make it to the end.
Yep. All right, so that's it.
That's it.
Thank
We
you
have-
so much for coming.